This morning you woke up, reached for your phone, brewed your coffee, and set the day in motion. Every single one of those actions unfolded in the wrong order, and that sequence is not a matter of preference. It is a biological mandate. Your body's chemistry operates on a precise hour-by-hour, organ-by-organ schedule that nobody has ever assembled for you, until now. Over the past 4 months, each conversation answered the question, what happens when you do this? This one answers, when and exactly why at that hour, 600 a.m., the first glass of water you have not consumed any fluid for 7 to 8 hours. Plasma volume has contracted by 5 to 8% through overnight insensible losses, respiration, transepidermal evaporation, and the continuous production of concentrated urine. Blood viscosity has reached its 24-hour peak. Fibrinogen concentrations are elevated. Platelet agreeability is at its highest. The window between 600 a.m. and noon is when myocardial infarction and stroke incidence peak across every population ever studied, as Muller and colleagues documented in the New England Journal of Medicine. And your blood is at its thickest, most chromogenic state at the precise hour that window opens. 1 glass of water, 400 to 500 milliliters, before coffee, before food, before you check your phone. Plasma dilution begins within 15 to 20 minutes. Viscosity falls. The gastrocolic reflex, triggered by gastric distension from the water, stimulates colonic motility and initiates the morning bowel movement that skipping the water and reaching for coffee instead has been attempting to produce through caffeine stimulation. The water dilutes blood that was actively approaching a clotting state. 6:05 a.m., 5 minutes of movement. The first 5 minutes of movement after waking are more physiologically significant than the following 30. Synovial fluid in every joint has gelled overnight. The thixotropy described in the stretching discussion operates inside every joint capsule across 7 hours of stillness. Morning stiffness is not dysfunction, it is lubricant awaiting activation. The fluid gelled overnight thins by step 6. Those first 6 steps apply shear force that restores its liquid state. Within 60 seconds, the knees and hips are moving freely. Cartilage that received zero nutrient delivery overnight begins absorbing fresh synovial fluid through the compression and release pumping action of each footfall. Capillaries in the leg muscles, 75 to 80% of which collapse during sleep, carry no blood flow, begin reopening within 2 to 3 minutes of walking as the working muscles release local vasodilators. The perfusion surface area triples. The sluggishness that felt like not being a morning person was, in fact, partial ischemia, tissue receiving a fraction of its normal blood supply. 3 minutes of walking reopens the vessels. 10 minutes completes the full transition cascade, synovial thinning, capillary recruitment, venous pump activation, lymphatic flow initiation, and the BDNF release that the walking discussion described, beginning at minute 4 and building steadily throughout the walk. The hippocampal growth documented by Erickson and colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh. A measurable volumetric increase in the brain structure responsible for consolidating memory originates from the molecular cascade each morning walk initiates. Arms swing freely, head aligned over the shoulders, ears stacked vertically, chin parallel to the ground, eyes fixed on the horizon. The torsion cancellation mechanism described in the walking discussion reduces lumbar rotational loading by 60% per step. The cervical spine carries 5 kilograms instead of the 20 to 27 it bears when the head tilts forward into the screen posture most people unconsciously carry into their morning walk. 6:15 a.m. morning sunlight within the first hour of waking. Sunlight entering the eyes reaches the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, melanopsin containing neurons that do not contribute to vision but transmit signals directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the brain's master circadian clock. This signal resets every peripheral clock in the body, the liver, the pancreas, the adrenal glands, the gut, synchronizing all of them to the solar cycle. The cortisol awakening response, which peaks in the first 30 to 45 minutes after waking, is calibrated by this light signal. Without morning light, the clocks drift. The downstream timing of insulin sensitivity, melatonin release, core temperature rhythm, and cortisol cycling loses the precision that compounds in consequences across the remainder of the day. 10 minutes of outdoor light. Even on an overcast day, outdoor illumination registers 10 to 50 times more intense than indoor lighting. The signal requires the eyes, but the skin benefits independently. UVB initiates vitamin D synthesis in the epidermis. Near-infrared wavelengths penetrate to the mitochondrial level, enhancing ATP production through cytochrome C oxidase activation. The photobiomodulation pathway the sunlight discussion detailed. The sunlight is the synchronization signal every clock in your body has been waiting for since the moment you fell asleep. Walking and sunlight overlap. 10 minutes of outdoor walking in morning light captures the circadian reset, synovial thinning, capillary recruitment, BDNF initiation, and UVB exposure within a single window. The physics is simultaneous. There is no need to sequence what the body processes in parallel. 700 a.m., breakfast, the pancreas has a clock, and that clock peaks in the morning. Insulin sensitivity follows a circadian rhythm, highest in the morning, declining through the afternoon, lowest in the evening. Pancreatic beta cells secrete more insulin per unit of glucose load in the morning. Muscle cells are more responsive. Glucose uptake per unit of insulin is greater. Hepatic glycogen storage capacity is at its daily maximum during the morning hours. An identical meal consumed at 700 a.m. produces a lower glucose spike, a smaller insulin response, and more efficient glucose disposal than the same meal consumed at 900 p.m. The food is identical. The caloric content is identical. The body's capacity to process it is entirely different, because the pancreatic clock, the hepatic clock, and the muscle insulin receptor sensitivity all peak in the morning. Protein at breakfast matters specifically. The thermic effect of food is highest for protein, consuming 20 to 30% of its caloric content during digestion itself. The amino acids supply the substrate for muscle protein synthesis that the overnight fasting period suppressed. And the satiety signal per calorie is strongest for protein. The peptide YY and GLP-1 response from the gut produces more sustained fullness from 100 calories of protein than from 100 calories of carbohydrate or fat. Coffee after the water, not before. The water dilutes overnight viscosity before caffeine introduces additional cardiac demand through cortisol amplification. Caffeine consumed before water lands on a cardiovascular system still running thick blood. Caffeine consumed after water lands on a system that has already begun to normalize. The sequence matters because the interaction arrives on biology that is either at its greatest risk or has already been partially corrected. 800 a.m. to noon. The desk hours, 4 hours of sitting produces 4 hours of cumulative damage across systems that require periodic mechanical input to function. Every 30 to 45 minutes, 90 seconds of intentional movement reverses what the sitting has accumulated. 3 actions, 30 seconds each. Standing alone does not resolve the problem. A standing desk replaces the hip flexion of sitting with the static loading of standing, trading one compression pattern for another, and provides no mechanical input to the systems that require dynamic movement. The benefit lies in the transition. The act of changing position loads the joints through their range, pumps synovial fluid, recruits postural muscles through a new pattern, and delivers the shear force that the thixotropic fluid in every joint capsule requires to maintain its liquid state. Sitting for 30 minutes, then standing for 5, then sitting again captures more mechanical benefit than standing for 4 hours continuously, because the transitions produce the loading events that static positions, whether seated or upright, cannot. Thoracic extension, ears over shoulders, sternum lifted, 5 deep breaths at full lung volume. The upper back that has been rounding into kyphosis straightens. The rib cage that has been compressing the diaphragm opens. The diaphragm, now free to descend fully, contacts the vagus nerve at the diaphragmatic hiatus, delivering the mechanical vagal stimulation the breathing discussion described. Parasympathetic tone that has been drifting towards sympathetic dominance for the past 30 minutes is restored. Distance viewing, 60 seconds fixed on the most distant visible object. The ciliary muscle, locked in sustained contraction since the last break, releases its accommodation spasm. The static hold the vision discussion described, which produces blurred distance vision when you finally look up. As the muscle fully relaxes, convergence drops, pupils dilate, and the metabolic waste that accumulated during sustained contraction flushes with restored blood flow. 10 deliberate, slow blinks, full eyelid closure, meibomian gland compression, tear film restoration. The blink rate that dropped from 15 to 20 per minute to 4 to 6 during screen focus is manually compensated. The lipid layer, the outermost component of the tear film that prevents evaporation, is replenished by the meibomian gland expression that each complete blink produces. 90 seconds total posture eyes blinks every 30 to 45 minutes across the desk hours. The interventions are brief because the mechanisms they address accumulate gradually. 30 minutes of sitting does not produce permanent damage. 30 minutes of sitting followed by 90 seconds of correction resets the accumulation entirely. The harm originates from uninterrupted sitting, not from sitting itself. 10:00 a.m. mid-morning reset. Mid-morning is when the cortisol awakening response has fully resolved and the body transitions into its sustained daytime metabolic state. For anyone practicing time-restricted eating, the 10:00 a.m. window is when the first meal produces the most favorable insulin response, after the early morning cortisol peak has cleared. Eating during the cortisol peak amplifies the insulin response beyond what the meal alone would generate. The cortisol-insulin interaction means a very early breakfast consumed during the cortisol surge may produce a larger glucose spike than the identical meal consumed an hour later when cortisol has declined. The 7:00 a.m. breakfast timing works when cortisol peaks early and resolves by then. The 10:00 a.m. timing works when the cortisol peak extends later, particularly relevant for the evening, shifted chronotype described in the circadian discussion. A glass of water at 10:00 a.m., the second of the day, maintains the plasma dilution and replaces the fluid the kidneys have been processing since the cortisol-driven morning diuresis began. Mid-morning hydration is not about thirst. It is about sustaining the viscosity reduction the first glass achieved across the hours when cardiac risk remains elevated. 12:30 p.m. walk after eating. Blood glucose peaks 30 to 60 minutes after a meal. Walking during this window activates GUT4 transporters in the leg muscles, glucose channels that migrate to the muscle cell surface and extract glucose from the bloodstream without requiring insulin. 10 minutes at a moderate pace is sufficient. The glucose that would have remained elevated for 90 minutes, producing the post-meal drowsiness, the afternoon fog, the energy crash described in the fatigue discussion, is instead channeled into the muscle cells that are burning it as fuel for locomotion. The walk treats the glucose problem through glucose disposal rather than masking the drowsiness with caffeine. The very molecule causing the sleepiness is eliminated by muscle contraction rather than concealed by a stimulant. The caffeine half-life is 5 to 6 hours. Coffee consumed at 100 p.m. is still producing diuretic and stimulant effects at 700 p.m., when the body should be transitioning towards sleep. The post-lunch walk replaces the afternoon coffee for anyone who understands what the drowsiness actually is. 1:30 p.m. The nap window. Adenosine has been accumulating since 1600 a.m., and the circadian system provides a natural trove that every culture on Earth has recognized. Adenosine, the molecule that builds during wakefulness and generates sleep pressure, has been rising for 7.5 hours. The post-lunch circadian dip creates a natural decline in alertness that aligns precisely with this adenosine load. A 20-minute nap before 200 p.m. clears accumulated adenosine from the synaptic cleft without entering slow-wave sleep, remaining confined to stage 1 and stage 2 non-REM, which is sufficient for adenosine clearance and memory consolidation without the grogginess a longer nap produces. The 200 p.m. cutoff matters. Napping after 200 p.m. clears enough adenosine to reduce sleep pressure at bedtime, pushing sleep onset later and compressing the total sleep duration that overnight recovery requires. The nap is a tool with a defined time window. Inside that window, outside it, it undermines the night. 300 to 500 p.m., the exercise window, if your day includes deliberate exercise, resistance training, a longer walk, cycling, swimming, this is when the body is physiologically engineered to perform it. Core body temperature peaks between 300 and 500 p.m. Muscle contractile force is at its daily maximum. Identical muscles produce measurably greater force at 400 p.m. than at 800 a.m. Joint flexibility peaks because synovial fluid viscosity has reached its daily minimum after a full day of movement. Reaction time is fastest. Pain tolerance is highest. The same exercise intensity feels less demanding in the afternoon than in the morning because the pain processing threshold rises with the circadian temperature curve. Injury risk is lowest during this window. The combination of warm muscles, pliable joints, peak neuromuscular coordination, and maximum core temperature produces the most resilient musculoskeletal state the body achieves in any 24-hour period. Morning exercise is not harmful. The morning walk, described at 1600 a.m., is low intensity and captures circadian, synovial, and vascular benefits that fully justify its early timing. But high intensity or resistance exercise, where both injury risk and performance matter, aligns naturally with the afternoon temperature peak. For anyone whose schedule demands morning exercise, the physics still works. The benefits still accrue. The afternoon window is optimal, not mandatory. The worst exercise window is the one that never happens. 400 p.m. The hydration shift. Every milliliter consumed after this hour is on a collision course with the 200 a.m. bladder. The nocturia discussion described the gravitational mechanism. Fluid that pooled in the legs throughout the day redistributes centrally after lying down and fills the bladder in the early morning hours. Fluid consumed after 400 p.m. adds directly to that volume. Front-loading 70% of the day's fluid intake before this hour means the kidneys process the bulk while you are awake and the bathroom is accessible. This is not a shift to zero. Thirst after 400 p.m. should be addressed with small sips. Dehydration thickens the blood, but large volumes, a glass with dinner, tea on the couch, should be consumed earlier. The overnight kidneys receive minimal workload. The bladder enters the night near empty. 600 p.m. dinner, the liver has a clock, and that clock is about to switch programs. The liver's metabolic programming shifts after dark, from glycogen storage to glycogenolysis and gluconeogenesis. Hepatic lipogenesis, the conversion of surplus carbohydrate into fat, accelerates during the evening hours. The carbohydrate load consumed at 700 a.m. is stored as glycogen. The identical load consumed at 900 p.m. is converted into triglycerides. Dinner timing before 700 p.m., ideally 3 hours before bed, allows the digestive process to complete before the body transitions into its overnight fasting program. Hidden evening sodium in cheese, cured meats, condiments, and bread triggers a delayed renal excretion that peaks at 200 to 300 a.m. That sodium activates overnight water retention, followed by a renal flush that fills the bladder hours after falling asleep. Evening sugar generates an insulin spike, followed by a reactive drop that triggers additional renal fluid excretion on the same overnight timeline. Alcohol suppresses vasopressin. The kidneys lose the hormonal brake that would otherwise concentrate urine during sleep. And the bladder fills from two directions simultaneously, as the nocturia discussion described. Dinner is not merely about what you eat. It is about when you eat and what is concealed within it that the kidneys will process at 2:00 in the morning. 800 p.m. screen light and the melatonin window, the suprachiasmatic nucleus that morning sunlight synchronized at 6:15 a.m. is now preparing the opposite signal. Melatonin release from the pineal gland begins approximately 2 hours before natural sleep onset. Melatonin does not produce sleep. It signals to every system in the body that sleep is approaching, initiating the cascade of core temperature reduction, metabolic program switching, and immune system activation that restorative sleep requires. The same melanosis receptors that morning sunlight activated respond to blue wavelength light from screens with sufficient intensity to suppress melatonin release. The pineal gland's melatonin signal, which should begin 2 hours before sleep onset, is delayed. 2 hours of evening screen exposure can shift melatonin onset by 60 to 90 minutes, compressing the sleep window. Blue light-blocking glasses with amber lenses filter the suppressive wavelengths. Night mode on devices reduces blue emission, but typically not enough. The most effective intervention is reducing screen exposure in the final 90 minutes before bed, shifting to activities that do not involve direct illumination at close range. A physical book under warm light, conversation, or the bedtime sequence outlined below. Bedroom temperature matters. Core body temperature must drop by approximately 1 degrees C for sleep onset to occur. The hypothalamus triggers peripheral vasodilation, particularly in the hands and feet, to radiate heat from the core to the skin surface. A bedroom that is too warm impedes this heat dissipation. Core temperature cannot fall sufficiently and sleep onset is delayed. A bedroom kept between 16 and 19 degrees C provides the thermal gradient the body requires to shed the heat that sleep initiation demands. Warm feet in a cool room accelerate sleep onset because dilated blood vessels in the feet radiate heat efficiently. Socks in bed accelerate the core temperature drop the hypothalamus requires. Cool air on the skin, warm feet beneath the covers, and the core temperature falls through the gradient the hypothalamus needs. 900 p.m., legs up the wall, the fluid that has been pooling in your legs all day is about to fill your bladder. Unless you process it now, 20 minutes with the legs elevated above heart level. The gravitational fluid described in the 400 p.m. section drains centrally. You urinate before bed, processing the leg fluid while still awake. The volume that would have awakened you at 200 a.m. is already gone. Compression stockings during the day prevent the pooling. Less pooling means less nocturnal bladder filling and fewer nighttime awakenings, as the nocturia discussion outlined. Combining daily walking, compression stockings, and evening leg elevation addresses the mechanism at 3 distinct points in the chain. The legs up period is also the evening stretching window, and the timing is deliberate. Fascia is most compliant in the evening after a full day of body temperature elevation and movement-driven hydration, as the stretching discussion explained. Stretching that produces the most lasting range of motion change is performed when tissue is warmest and most hydrated. Now, not in the morning when tissue is coolest and synovial fluid has been gelling overnight. 90-second sustained holds on the 3 or 4 tightest areas. Hip flexors shortened by the day sitting, hamstrings compressed by the desk chair, thoracic spine rounded from screen posture. Performing these while the legs are elevated captures both fascial remodeling and gravitational fluid processing within a single 20-minute window. Floor sitting during the evening, replacing the sofa with the floor for 30 to 60 minutes while reading or watching television, provides continuous low-level mobility demand that elevated seating eliminates. Getting down to the floor and rising from it loads the hip joints through deep flexion, recruits the quadriceps through a movement pattern that mirrors the sit-to-stand transfer governing functional independence after age 70, and preserves the ankle dorsiflexion range that elevated seating progressively erodes. The discomfort is the stimulus. The body shift position every few minutes because no floor position is sustainable indefinitely, and each shift is a micro-loading event the joints require and the sofa denies. 9:20 p.m. Cold water on the feet, 30 seconds in a basin or under the tap. Cold triggers rapid vasoconstriction. Baroreceptors register the change in peripheral resistance and initiate a parasympathetic shift. The reactive vasodilation that follows produces a warming flush persisting for 15 to 40 minutes. This parasympathetic priming prepares the autonomic nervous system for the bedtime sequence that follows, landing on a system already transitioning toward rest, rather than one still operating in the sympathetic mode that evening screen exposure may have sustained. 9:30 p.m. The bedtime sequence 3 actions, 30 seconds each. Floss. The interproximal biofilm that accumulated over 24 hours is disrupted before it matures into the pathogenic state that compromises the gingival epithelial barrier. The oral systemic connection described in the gum disease discussion. Bacteria entering the bloodstream through inflamed gum tissue during 8 hours of sleep. Seeding arterial plaques reaching distant organs is prevented by 2 minutes of mechanical biofilm disruption. Gargle. 30 seconds of sustained pharyngeal muscle contraction against fluid resistance. The pharyngeal branch of the vagus activates a parasympathetic shift through a pathway distinct from humming, cold water, or breathing techniques. The pharyngeal constrictors, the muscles responsible for holding the airway open during sleep, as described in the snoring discussion, receive their daily isometric training stimulus hum for 60 seconds. One sustained note, the sinuses resonate. Sinus nitric oxide production increases 15-fold as acoustic vibration pumps no enriched air through the ostia into the nasal airway. The vagus nerve, millimeters from the vibrating vocal cords, receives direct mechanical stimulation. The exhale to inhale ratio locks at 3:1 or 41 without conscious effort. The vocal cords enforce it. The autonomic system shifts parasympathetic alley through dual vagal input, mechanical and respiratory, operating simultaneously. The body enters the state required for sleep onset without any deliberate attempt to relax. The physics produces the relaxation. If the legs buzz or crawl, both hands wrapped around each calf for 30 seconds. The mechanoreceptive fibers from deep pressure close the spinal gate in the dorsal horn, blocking the signal that the dropping dopamine can no longer suppress, as the restless legs discussion described. The reactive vasodilation after release provides a 5 to 15 minute window of quiet legs. That window is the sleep onset window, sleep position and nasal breathing left side. The esophageal gastric junction sits above the gastric pool on the left side. Gravity keeps acid in the stomach rather than allowing it to cross the lower esophageal sphincter. The inferior vena cava runs to the right of the spine. Left side sleeping avoids compressing it, preserving optimal venous return. Nasal breathing during sleep. Mouth closed. Air entering and exiting exclusively through the nose. The nasal airway filters, warms, and humidifies incoming air. The nasal mucosa produces nitric oxide that the bedtime humming amplified. The residual NO in the nasal passages continues, providing mild bronchodilation and pulmonary vasodilation through the first hours of sleep. Mouth breathing bypasses nasal filtration, dries the pharyngeal mucosa, drops the jaw and tongue backward, and narrows the pharyngeal space that gargling just trained the muscles to hold open. The snoring discussion described how this pharyngeal narrowing initiates the Bernoulli feedback loop that produces vibration and, in severe cases, complete airway collapse. Mouth tape. A strip of surgical tape holding the lips closed maintains the nasal breathing pattern for anyone whose mouth falls open after sleep onset. The day closes not with an alarm, with a sequence. assembled from every discussion that answered what without ever answering when. The water that diluted the clotting risk, the walk that opened the vessels, the light that synchronized the clocks, the protein that fueled the muscles, the 90-second corrections that reset what sitting accumulated, the post-meal walk that intercepted the glucose the pancreas could not clear alone, the nap that eliminated adenosine without borrowing from the night, the hydration cutoff that protected the overnight bladder, the dinner time to the liver's metabolic program, the leg elevation that processed the fluid before the kidneys had to, the bedtime sequence that sealed the oral barrier, trained the airway, activated the vagus, and positioned the body for the sleep the entire day was building toward. That timeline, every intervention placed at the hour the underlying physiology demands it, assembled from every discussion that answered what without answering when, is why the morning, the afternoon, and sleep became one continuous sequence the moment the mechanisms were finally arranged into the schedule the body had been running all along without anyone ever writing it down. Not one intervention is timed by preference. Every single one is timed by the physics of the body at that hour. The glass of water at 1600 a.m. is not a habit. It is a dilution of blood that peaks in thrombogenicity precisely at the hour the cardiac risk window opens. The sunlight at 60:15 is the synchronization signal every peripheral clock requires. The walk after lunch is glucose interception through a pathway the pancreas cannot access independently. The legs elevated at 900 p.m. is not relaxation. It is gravitational reversal of the fluid that would otherwise fill the bladder at 200 in the morning. And the second thing this assembly revealed was that none of these interventions were unfamiliar. Every one had been explained, demonstrated, and understood, but the hour each one belonged to had never been assembled until the physics of the clock was placed beside the physics of the body.